Hi there. I'm Will Lowen. I am the pastor here at Trinity Mennonite Church. Thanks for tuning in to our sermon videos. You know, most of the time when we sit down for a meal, we don't put much thought into how it came together. And oftentimes, too, in our Christian life, we don't put much thought into the meal that we are enjoying, the feast of the kingdom. But sometimes we do. We want to pull back the curtains a little. We want to peek into the kitchen to see exactly how this works. What classical theologians call the atonement is this question of what exactly did Jesus' life and death accomplish, and how did it do that? So this January and February, I'm putting a few of these sermons together to talk about these questions. But I want them to be sermons that inform and inspire, not just academic lectures. So we're going to be asking these questions in a way that I hope will invite us to enjoy the meal better, to get more out of it, to be more inspired by the meal, and invite other people into that kingdom celebration. So thanks again for tuning into these videos, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out.
So the scripture reading for this morning comes from the book of Revelation. And I will be reading from the Common English. It's Revelation chapter 5, verses 1 to 8. I don't preach from Revelation very often. And nobody's ever complained that I don't preach out of Revelation enough. So I'm guessing most of you don't read it very often either. So this will be a new text for some of you, but here we are, Revelation chapter 5, and I'll be reading verses 1 to 8. Then I saw a scroll in the right hand of the one seated on the throne. It had writing on the front and to the back, and it was sealed with 7 seals. I saw a powerful angel who proclaimed in a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or look inside it. So I began to weep and weep because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look inside of it. Then one of the elders said to me, "Don't weep. Look, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has emerged victorious, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." Then, in between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders, I saw a lamb, standing as if it had been slain. It had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are God's 7 spirits sent out into the whole earth. He came forward and took the scroll from the right hand of the one seated in the throne. When he took the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each held a harp of golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. So, making sense of Revelation text is not easy to do. Often when people talk about it as though it is easy, I become skeptical. Because these are not easy images for us to look at. We rely on images. We use metaphors and symbols in our everyday speech. There are some people who say we are becoming less literate as a society, which is interesting because in many ways this is what differentiates us from generations past, that almost everybody can read. Almost everybody can read books and signs and learn all the information they need because we can read. And instead what's happening now is we're relying so much on symbols that we often stop reading. Our vehicle dashboards have symbols. The signs on the road have symbols. When we go shopping, we rely as much on the logos and brands around us than on the words that are underneath. We are people of symbols. We are meaning-making creatures. We find stories and symbols all around us. And a lot of times we find more comfort in those symbols in different ways of explaining things than what is literally, technically true. So one example is death. When we talk about death, we have euphemisms. We have other words that soften the blow. So for us to say that somebody died, death, this is a heavy word, an uncomfortable topic. So often what we do is we find a softer way of saying it. Exactly the same meaning, but just a little bit softer to hear. So we will say that somebody passed away instead. We might use something even more colorful and fun. We might say that somebody kicked the bucket. Now, if you've had the benefit of speaking with someone whose first language is in English, every now and then, if you have a good relationship with them, meaning if they trust you, they will ask you to stop and explain what you just said. What do you mean, kicked the bucket? All right, and what bucket are you talking about? And then you'll find yourself, wait a second, okay, that's an expression. Where does it come from? I don't know. We don't have an image of a bucket that we carry through life, and then when we're done, we kick it somewhere. We just know this means this is the end of the road. Oh, well, which road are we driving on? Oh, okay, well, it's as though you're walking. So we have these things that naturally make sense to us, and it's better than the direct saying, but we are so comfortable in that space we often can't explain it to other people. And other languages do the same thing. Many of them have similar words for passed away. They might say that the person has disappeared, that they are no longer. That can just be the explanation. We have this thing, this way of softening the blow, of explaining difficult things in ways that our fragile ears and emotions can handle. We might even make it a little bit more heroic. So a little while ago, I posted on my Facebook wall that Bishop Desmond Tutu had passed away, and we prayed. He was one of the people we prayed about here. And on my wall, I wrote that he fought the good fight. Now, if you're comfortable with the English language, you have a pretty good idea of what that means, what I meant by that. It means that in his life, he was engaged in a struggle against bad things. And in the case of Desmond Tutu, fighting against racism, fighting against the division of people based on arbitrary things. So he fought the good fight, but he is no longer fighting. And when somebody we know dies of cancer, then we will often say that they lost the battle. They lost the battle against cancer. Well, what did that battle look like? We see that happen around us far too common, and it's a good way of explaining it because we see them valiantly fighting against something rather than just being a victim of circumstances. But what did the battle look like? They didn't take up weapons. They didn't cover themselves in armor. They weren't following a war drum. But they were still in a battle. We explain things that way. But what was the battle? Then we take a disease, cancer, we take a process happening inside of that person's body, and we give it language, colorful language, to make it sound like a bigger, more heroic thing. And I think it's a good thing that we do that. And then when we talk about people fighting actual battles, when we talk about soldiers coming home, then, well, how do we explain their deaths in our society? That they died in the struggle for freedom, the struggle for human rights. Well, it's the same exercise that we do. It's the same mental thing. We're taking a dark and difficult reality and we're putting it in new, colorful, more helpful explanations. But in the same way, it's difficult to reconcile that. If a non-English speaker, or if somebody outside of our culture were to ask, okay, like how does their death contribute to our freedom? Well, if they hadn't fought, if they hadn't died, then the forces of evil and oppression would have come over us, and we would have been speaking a different language. And okay, but like, how did their death do? Because the side that lost the war, if we look through history, we would celebrate that Canada won World War II, that our side won World War I. Well, the countries that lost that war, more of their soldiers died. So then, did they also explain to their people they lost in the battle for freedom, that their death bought freedom because more of their soldiers died, but less of them have freedom? So these explanations, they often don't stand up to critical analysis, but when somebody dies, there's no room for critical analysis, and there shouldn't be. Because when somebody has died and a nation is grieving, a family is grieving, a network of friends, a community is grieving, we don't need somebody to stand there and, nitpick the explanations. Oh, but what about this way of looking? What about this philosophy? We don't need any of that, because we're grieving and we want to process that. But we can ask ourselves fair questions about the accuracy of those explanations. That when we hear that somebody has died, we often have a lot of questions. That we as emotional people and at the same time rational people have to deal with in order to process these difficult things. So we want to know how somebody died. In some ways, we want to know the technical details. Oh, it was this disease, this part of their body stopped functioning. Oh, it was this conflict in this part of the world, or is this kind of an accident? We want to know at least that, at least in some ways, so that we can say, oh, well, did the person smoke all their life? Oh, they died of lung cancer? Well, if I don't smoke, then I probably won't die of lung cancer. Then we've benefited from learning that explanation. But sometimes, too, we have a system in our brains that somebody is so good, so young, so innocent, so healthy. How could this person die? And when we read the news that somebody has died of COVID, there's a part of us that says, okay, but did they have underlying conditions? Right? Because then if we don't, then we feel, okay, well then I'm safer and the disease isn't scary to me. But the loss is still the same. So we want to be able to explain away the scary parts. But sometimes the scariest thing is an innocent person dying needlessly. So then that's the how, and it's an unanswerable question. How can a child die needlessly? How can somebody that we love, somebody who, when we're in their presence, the whole world makes sense, how can that person die? So then there's kind of a deeper, kind of almost cosmological, like a whole, universal explanation sort of needed to answer that how. And sometimes, too, when somebody who's doing something important, when they die, then we're left like, well, how? They were doing such important work. They were carrying out such a needed, necessary legacy. How can that person die? How can all of their work end here? So it's kind of a messianic thing that we have. We know people in our lives who are so important they have to survive. And then finally, the last how that I thought of is, well, how is this death part of something bigger? We can take a little bit of comfort if this death accomplishes something. Medically, if somebody dies, but they've died of a disease, and in the process of treating this person, new research was done, new systems were attempted, and now the doctor knows better for the next time. Well, if they died on the battlefield, then they were at least part of something, and our guys won, and it's okay a little bit better if that person died because they died fighting for something good. We sometimes have a transactional understanding of death, that, yeah, this person died, but in some ways we're sort of trading that person for freedom. We're trading that person for a better understanding of science. Sometimes if a person dies in a traffic accident, then the community says, wait a second, there should have been a stoplight there. Then the person wouldn't have died. And then we put up a stoplight and nobody else dies there. Then we at least can be comforted, okay, that person died so that none of us have to die at that same intersection. All of this happens when we deal with people's deaths. And so all of this is happening behind the scenes when Jesus dies. That the people in his life, the disciples, the group of followers, men and women who learned from him, all of them were asking all of these exactly the same things. And so then we, as Jesus' followers many years later, we ask the same questions, but the people before us have come up with answers. And so then we get to learn those answers. We're comforted and empowered by those same answers. All of us react to different deaths in different ways, and so also kind of people in history. So now we as people in the 21st century, we're dealing with the death of Jesus in a new way because everybody before us has kind of offered us new explanations. Last week I talked about scapegoating and how there's sort of an ancient ritual of passing blame onto somebody, and so then Jesus became that scapegoat that we as humanity put our blame on him, and then Jesus carried those sins away from us. A religious, even philosophical explanation of what happened. Most of us are used to a legal explanation, a transactional explanation that Jesus died because there was sin and God was angry, and then Jesus' death appeases that anger. That's a legal explanation. That Jesus' death is part of a legal system. But for much of the history of the church, people understood Jesus' death as participating in a military exercise. So in Revelation, we have this strange text of John, not the Apostle John, but John is the writer here. He's on this island, and he's sent away from, it's a penal colony. It's a slave trading island, but he's there as kind of a punishment. And he's writing about everything that he sees. He has a vision of how all of this makes sense. So there are lots of different ways of explaining Revelation. I think, my understanding is that many of those ways have been lost in history. That the initial audience, they read it, they understood it their own way, and the next generation understood a little bit less, and a little bit less, and ever since then people have kind of added new meanings back into it, and so what we have now is kind of a mixture of those things. But the books that I've read explain that these 7 seals, there's a scroll, and the explanation is that the scroll is sort of the story of life, of humanity. But the 7 seals that are blocking it were the 7 emperors of Rome around the time that this was written. And so if you go through chapters 5, 6, and 7, each seal sort of represents a different political situation, and those political situations sort of line up with how those 7 emperors operated and ruled over not just the political aspect of Rome, but the people and the church within the Roman Empire. And so the writer is explaining that the seal is here, that the scroll is there with the 7 seals. Nobody can open the scrolls. Nobody is more powerful than those 7 emperors, is the kind of the explanation that I've gotten. Except for the Lamb. Now, the 7 horns and the 7 eyes is, I think, just part of that kind of symbolism that would have made more sense in those days. But there are also 7 churches a little bit later on. But the Lamb is a symbol of Jesus. And it explains, as I read, this is the Lion of Judah. But the Lamb is there, and the Lamb has been slain. The Lamb has been killed, as lambs often were, not just for food, but also for ritual sacrifice, not just in the Jewish religion, but in various religions of that area, of that time period. But the Lamb is there, not just coincidentally, the Lamb is there as the victor. The Lamb is able to open the scrolls because the Lamb has won the victory. So how does this defeated lamb, this lamb that was killed, how is it the victor? Well, the church sort of has this understanding that something happened in between Good Friday, Jesus dies on the cross, and then Easter morning, Jesus is arisen. So what happens for those few days where Jesus is dead? Well, there's explanations if we go through different parts of the New Testament. Paul explains that Jesus died in the battle against evil, against Satan. The writer of Hebrews explains the same thing, that Jesus' death, Jesus' whole life, was to come and win a victory over evil. And so there's sort of an explanation that during that day and a half, Jesus descended into hell, and he led with him an army of angels. They defeated Satan, and so then we, as followers of Jesus, get to participate in that military victory. The problem with that is that many of us have, especially within the Mennonite church, when we look at the life of Jesus, Jesus was a peaceful man. When we look at the teachings of Jesus, he taught forgiveness, he taught peace, he taught reconciliation. When we look at the angriest, most violent episodes in Jesus' life, the one where Peter cuts off the soldier's ear, the one where Jesus storms into the temple, Jesus tells Peter to put the sword away. Jesus is emptying the temple, the part of the temple where the Gentiles are supposed to be able to worship. Jesus teaches peace exclusively, and then for us as humans to say, okay, but what happened was a military victory. There's a difficulty in kind of reconciling those two things. So in some of my reading, I put it on a slide, and so now I have to find it in the book. Here we go. I read the heavier theology, so you don't have to. So I can barely understand some of this stuff, but this one jumped out to me. It says, the cross is not a detour or a hurdle on the way to the kingdom, nor is it even the way to the kingdom. It is the kingdom come. So for Jesus to die on the cross is the kingdom. It is the message. So it goes with this book here called The Nonviolent Atonement, trying to explain the life of the deeper meanings of of the example of Jesus through sort of a nonviolent Anabaptist Mennonite kind of lens. But the question that many of us as human beings face is, okay, well, yeah, we need to be peaceful. That seems to be what Jesus asked for. But does it work? What does it accomplish if we're just peaceful and we get pushed around our whole lives? That doesn't seem like the way that we should be living either. And so there's an example that I wanted to read here. I won't get into every word of it. But while Pilate was ruling over Judea, there was part of the larger effort that Pilate and Caesar in Rome wanted to do was in each of their little colonies, they wanted to replace all of the cultural values, all the religious stuff, all the political stuff with Roman things. Because if they still held on to their old symbols, they would be less loyal to Rome and more vulnerable to an invading army, more sympathetic to an invading army, and never quite giving full allegiance to Rome. And this is very much the concern about the Jews living in Israel. So, Pilate had a plan. He was going to take Roman statues, Roman symbols, and he was going to set them up in the temple. So, he did this secretly, and in the night, he installed all of these Roman images in the temple, which set off a fury of revolt among the rabbis, among the Pharisees, among all of the religious leaders. So they were appealing for Pilate to take them out. Religious leaders from all over Israel were flocking to Jerusalem to make an appeal. And what did they bring with them? An army? Did they bring swords? No. They wouldn't have been able to do anything like that. There were people making an angry revolt, and they were called the Zealots, and one of the Zealots was among the 12 disciples. So what happened was, Pilate said, okay, we're going to have a conversation about this, so we need you to show up at this and this time. So they were all there. They were all in the room, and the Roman soldiers were all around in the room. And Pilate said to the soldiers, bring your swords, but hide them. So they were all in there. He says, I want them to feel safe. And then they were all in the room. Pilate says, we're going to close the doors. And then he said, listen, this is what we are doing now. You don't have any other choice. We are leaving these symbols in here, and if you don't like it, you can die. We've got all these soldiers have swords. We're going to kill you now. What did they do? Did they rise up and fight? No. They knelt to the ground. They pulled their cloaks back, and they said, here's my neck. Cut it now. I would rather die than have these statues in this temple. All of them did that. And they hadn't planned that ahead of time. There wasn't a meeting ahead of time to say, oh, what are we going to do? No, the values of their religion were so strong that there was no other option than to die in that fight. So, what did their non-violent protest accomplish? Pilate had no other choice. He took the symbols out, and the next governor tried a similar thing, and the people resisted exactly the same way. Non-violent opposition often seems weak, and it often feels like it's kind of a lesser way of doing things. But oftentimes in the history of the church, it has been the only way that the people could do anything. And many people would argue it's the only way that good things ever have happened in history. The victory that Jesus wins is a demonstration over those forces of evil. The people who understand the death of Jesus through this lens, so this is called Christus Victor, meaning Jesus is the victor. Jesus wins. The people who explain it that way through a peaceful way, through a narrative way, it's Jesus wins the story is sort of the explanation here, is that Jesus being willing to die is so strong a message that the enemies of good have been defeated. If Jesus, someone who is entitled to rule the universe, if he is willing to accept death, if he's willing to accept humiliation, then the forces of evil have no power over him or anyone else who would follow Jesus. So when we read things through that lens, then Jesus didn't come to tell us a bunch of nice stories. Jesus didn't come to just help us feel happier in our lives, although those stories are powerful, and yeah, happiness is a pretty good thing. Jesus came to model for us what we do with our power. Jesus came to model for us how we lift up other people, often by lowering our sense of entitlement, what we deserve, and lifting up our sense of what other people deserve. So Jesus wins the victory, not just by defeating the enemy, but by demonstrating through love and compassion that the enemy is already defeated. So may we learn from that. May we follow that example, that by following Jesus, we are participating in a victory that has already been won, that the forces of evil have no power over us because they had no power over Jesus, the one that we follow and model our lives after. Thanks for following along. If you have deeper questions about some of this stuff, I can share some of my resources with you. But my hope is that we will lean into the victory that Jesus has won and participate in that same struggle over evil in our lives.